Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the absolute mechanics of fear. We're going on a pretty fascinating journey, moving all the way from those surface-level jump scares that make us spill our popcorn, right down to the deep, unsettling psychological roots of true terror. If you've ever wondered why certain stories just haunt your thoughts long after the screen goes dark, you are definitely in the right place.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the anatomy of fear, move into the deeply unsettling world of the uncanny and animated, talk about how to actually execute the scare, and finally, look at how to truly earn that final shock. Let's get right to it.
Kicking things off with Section 1, the anatomy of fear.
It's wild to look at how our understanding of fear has evolved over time. Like back in 1895, the very first cinematic jump scare wasn't some terrifying monster or a ghost, it was literally just a silent film by the Lumiere brothers titled Arrival of a Train. It was just footage of a train speeding toward the camera, but audiences hadn't seen anything like it. It triggered this pure fight-or-flight response. People literally leapt out of the way. Fast forward to 1919, and you've got Sigmund Freud decoding the psychology behind what creeps us out. Right up to 2025, where indie filmmakers are literally crunching audience retention data to perfectly optimize their cinematic shocks.
Because as storytellers quickly figured out, if you want to sustain fear, you got to mess with the mind. Physical shocks wear off, but twisting reality, that lingers. You can isolate a character completely from the outside world, or use an unreliable narrator so the audience feels totally vulnerable. Or take the classic creepy child trope. It works so incredibly well because it takes something completely innocent and corrupts it. We're no longer just dodging a physical threat, our whole perception of reality is under attack.
Moving right along to Section 2, the uncanny and animated. So ask yourself this, why is a lifeless doll suddenly blinking, or some stiff automaton taking a step forward, just so much more terrifying than a regular physical threat? I mean, a guy with a weapon is scary, for sure, but a toy monkey randomly crashing its symbols together on its own in a dark room? No way. That chills us straight to the bone. Why exactly do animated objects terrify us so much?
Well, the answer actually lies in Sigmund Freud's concept of the uncanny, or in German, unheimlich. Freud argued that the uncanny isn't just about encountering something completely alien. It's the intense dread we feel when something totally familiar becomes unsettlingly strange. It stirs up these repressed infantile beliefs. See, when we're little, we don't have a sharp line between what's living and what's lifeless. We kind of secretly believe our toys might just wake up and become animated. Eventually, we grow up and we repress that idea. But the second we see a lifeless object moving on its own, boom, that repressed belief comes rushing right back, and it is absolutely terrifying.
Looking closely at his 1919 essay, Freud actually builds on some earlier work by Ernst Jentsch. He points out that true uncanniness hits us when we genuinely doubt whether an apparently animate being is actually alive. Or, on the flip side, wondering if a totally lifeless object might suddenly become animated. Think about wax figures, artificial dolls, automatons. They trigger this profound intellectual uncertainty. Our brains basically glitch. We literally cannot categorize what we're looking at, and that cognitive dissonance manifests as this creeping, deep-seated horror.
To really nail this down, Freud heavily analyzes E.T.A. Hoffman's dark story, The Sandman, and it is the perfect example of this. The main character, Nathaniel, falls madly in love with Olympia, who is beautiful but strangely silent. The deepest, most visceral terror in the whole narrative drops when we realize Olympia is actually a lifeless wooden doll. She's animated entirely by clockwork and stolen eyes. It is the ultimate uncanny scenario. That boundary between the living and the mechanical is just completely shattered.
Freud also points out another wild, uncanny trigger, repetition compulsion. Imagine checking into a hotel and getting room 62. Then later you get a train ticket with seat 62. Then your coat check number is 62. When a harmless event just keeps repeating like that, it stops feeling like a random coincidence and starts feeling like demonic fate. This is an incredibly practical tool for storytellers. Sometimes building unbearable tension is as simple as making innocent coincidences repeat until they feel terrifyingly inevitable.
Which brings us to Section 3, executing the scare. So how do we actually take all this deep psychological theory and weaponize it for the screen? If we look impartially at some 2025 indie filmmaking data, we see two very distinct methods. On one hand, you have the raw, immersive, unpolished style of found footage. On the other, highly polished traditional cinematic techniques. Both are totally viable, but they operate very differently in today's market.
The raw data here is super fascinating.
Found footage is a literal goldmine for indie creators because it taps into a massive, very forgiving built-in community that keeps budgets super low and shoots incredibly fast. But it struggles heavily on modern streaming platforms. Because found footage is notoriously slow burn, viewers tend to drop off and streamers end up losing ad revenue. Cinematic styles, on the other hand, definitely demand higher budgets, and finding that initial audience is tougher. But they give the director really tight control over the pacing, and that keeps streaming audiences locked in right through those crucial ad breaks. So the delivery mechanism of fear is literally being dictated by the economics of attention. Crazy, right?
But hey, what if you aren't holding a camera? What if you're writing a book? Writers can absolutely emulate that cinematic jump scare right on the page. Obviously, you can't blast a loud noise at the reader, but you can abruptly interrupt a serene, dreamlike flow of description with something completely grotesque. You can cut off a character's dialogue mid-sentence as a threat literally drops into the scene. Or you can drop a sudden, jarring revelation, like realizing a loved one has been manipulating you the entire time. That shock to the reader's system is just as potent as a visual jump scare.
All right, final stop, Section 4, earning the final shock.
Because look, just having a character unexpectedly die at the very end, that isn't enough. That's just a cheap shock. The absolute best horror finales work because they tie the emotional arc directly to the physical horror. Take a movie like The Sixth Sense. The twist fundamentally reframes every single interaction you just spent 2 hours watching. Or Get Out, where the physical escape is intrinsically tied to the protagonist's thematic and emotional journey. The most memorable finales happen when the physical terror and the psychological trauma are completely, inextricably intertwined.
To make sure your finale actually hits hard, industry screenwriters use a very specific 3-part checklist. First up, has the protagonist actually changed? Second, what was the horror really about beneath the surface? And third, is there a final revelation that totally recontextualizes the story? You absolutely must link your deep, uncanny themes directly to your character's final arc. If the monster gets defeated, but the protagonist hasn't grown at all, the ending is going to fall completely flat.
So as you go craft your next script, write your next thriller, or even just sit down to watch a new scary movie, I want to leave you with one vital question to think about. Is the horror truly earned? Does the ending just offer a cheap, loud jump scare, or does it masterfully exploit our deepest fears, those deeply repressed anxieties of animated dolls, absolute isolation, and unreality, so that the terror stays with you forever? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer to decode the anatomy of fear. Keep analyzing, keep creating, and I'll catch you in the next one.